carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain, the kind of wind that had seen too many years and kept every secret to itself. Out here, hope was not something people talked about. It was something they carried quietly, like a worn photograph tucked into a pocket, pulled out only in moments of deep loneliness. This land had broken many before it, yet it still stood wide and patient, waiting to see who would stay and who would leave. On a road carved by wagon wheels and regret, she walked forward with nothing but tired shoes, a thin coat, and a heart that refused to stop believing. She had lost more than most folks her age ever should. Home was no longer a place, just a memory that ached when the nights grew cold. The past clung to her like dust, no matter how many miles she put behind her. People she trusted had turned away when she needed them most, and promises once spoken with warmth had faded into silence. Still, she kept moving because stopping meant giving in, and giving in meant admitting the world had won. Hope was the last thing she owned, and she guarded it like treasure. The ranch appeared just before sundown, sitting quiet against the rolling hills, weathered wood glowing soft in the fading light. It was not grand or inviting, but it looked steady, like it belonged exactly where it stood. A fence lined the land, old but standing, much like the man who leaned against one of its posts. He watched the horizon, not in search of anything, but as someone used to waiting. The land around him bore the marks of long days and hard seasons, yet there was care in the way it was kept. This was a place built on patience, not luck. He had learned early that life did not hand out kindness freely. Everything he owned had come from sweat, loss, and choices that weighed heavy on his shoulders. The ranch had once been fuller, louder, shared with laughter that no longer echoed through the fields. Time had taken its share from him, leaving behind silence and responsibility. He stayed because leaving felt like betrayal, not just to the land, but to memories that still breathed through every beam and post. He believed some things were meant to be held on to, even when they hurt. When he finally noticed her walking up the road, something in him stilled. Travelers passed through now and then, usually with eyes full of hunger or trouble. She carried neither. What he saw instead was exhaustion mixed with quiet strength, the kind that came from surviving more than anyone should have to explain. She stopped at the edge of the fence, unsure if she was welcome, unsure of everything except the need to rest. Their first words were simple, careful, shaped by lives that had taught them not to expect too much. He offered water without asking questions. She accepted without pride. In that small exchange, something shifted, though neither of them named it. The land seemed to listen as she spoke of needing work, of being willing to earn her keep, of not asking for charity. He heard more in her voice than her words allowed. He heard a person standing at the edge of giving up, choosing instead to try once more. Days passed, marked by routine and unspoken understanding. She worked hard, rising early and resting late, learning the rhythm of the ranch as if she had always belonged to it. He watched from a distance, not out of suspicion, but because letting someone close again felt dangerous. Every hammer strike, every shared meal, chipped away at walls both of them had built without realizing it. The ranch felt different, lighter somehow, as if it had been waiting for her presence. At night, when the sky stretched wide and full of stars, memories crept in. She remembered nights spent wondering if anyone would ever see her for who she was, not what she had lost. He remembered promises he had made long ago, promises he believed he had failed to keep. Neither spoke of these thoughts, but they lived between them, shaping every glance and pause. Hope, once fragile, began to take root in ways that scared them both. People in nearby towns had their opinions. A woman with no past that could be easily explained drew questions. A man who kept to himself drew rumors. Together they drew attention neither wanted. Yet there was something about the way they moved through the days that felt honest, untouched by the noise of others. They were not pretending to be something they were not. They were simply surviving, together. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, she stood by the fence where he often rested. She spoke of dreams she had buried long ago, of wanting a life that felt safe, of fearing that hope might betray her again. He listened, really listened, in a way few ever had. When he spoke, he did not offer promises, he offered truth. He told her that the land had taught him one thing above all else, that nothing lasting came without risk. Slowly, without realizing when it happened, he began giving her more than shelter and work. He gave her trust. He gave her space to heal. In doing so, he felt something return to him that he thought was gone forever. His heart, once guarded and quiet, began to stir. Love did not arrive loudly or suddenly. It came in shared silence, in small gestures, in the way he noticed when she was tired before she said a word. But the past is never content to stay buried. Shadows stretched long across the land, and questions left unanswered began to surface. She carried a secret that weighed heavier with each passing day. He sensed it, though he never pressed her. Both understood that peace built on silence could only last so long. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to come to light. One morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, dust rising behind him like a warning. She saw him first, and fear tightened in her chest. Whatever she had run from had found her at last. He noticed the change in her, the way her hands shook, the way her eyes searched for escape. In that moment, the fragile world they had built stood on the edge of collapse. As the rider drew closer, she realized hope alone might not be enough this time. And as he stepped forward to stand beside her, she wondered if accepting his heart meant risking its destruction. The land watched, silent and knowing, as the past rode straight toward them, ready to claim what it believed was still owed. The rider did not hurry. That was the first thing she noticed, and it frightened her more than if he had come at a gallop. His pace was steady, sure, as if he knew exactly where he was going and had all the time in the world to get there. Dust lifted with each step of the horse, hanging in the air like a warning that refused to fade. She took a small step back, then stopped herself. Running had been her answer once, and she had promised herself it would not always be. He stood close enough now that she could feel his presence without looking. He did not ask her who the rider was or why her face had gone pale. He only shifted slightly, placing himself between her and the road, not in a bold or dramatic way, but as something natural, almost instinctive. The land had taught him how to stand his ground, and it showed in moments like this. She swallowed hard, grateful and afraid all at once. As the horse came nearer, memories rose like a tide she could not hold back. She remembered a smaller place, crowded and loud, where kindness came with a price and silence was safer than truth. She remembered promises that had sounded solid but crumbled when tested. Leaving had not been brave. It had been necessary. She had walked away with nothing but hope because hope was lighter than regret. The rider finally stopped a short distance from the fence. He stayed mounted, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. There was no greeting, no smile. Just a long look that made her feel as though her past had stepped out of the shadows and taken shape. He spoke her name, and hearing it after so long felt like a hand closing around her throat. The sound carried across the open land, heavy and unwelcome. He turned slightly, just enough to let her answer if she chose. She did not. Words felt dangerous. Beside her, the man she had come to trust remained still, his jaw tight, his gaze sharp. He did not know the full story, but he knew enough to understand that this moment mattered. The rider glanced at him, measuring, calculating. Whatever he saw there made him cautious. After a tense moment, the rider tipped his hat, not in respect, but in recognition. He said he was only passing through, that he had business elsewhere. The lies sat poorly in the air. Then he added that the past had a way of catching up, no matter how far one went. With that, he turned his horse and rode on, leaving behind silence thick enough to touch. She did not breathe again until he disappeared over the hill. Her legs felt weak, and she reached for the fence to steady herself. He noticed and placed a hand near hers, not quite touching, giving her the choice. She nodded, and the small contact grounded her more than she expected. Still, fear lingered, curling in her chest like smoke after a fire. That night, sleep did not come easily. The wind rattled the windows, and every sound outside felt louder than it should. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the writer's words over and over. She knew this peace had been borrowed, not earned, and the debt was coming due. In the other room, he sat at the table longer than usual, nursing a cup of cold coffee and listening to the land. Something had changed, and he could feel it. By morning, routine tried to assert itself. Chores needed doing, animals needed care, and the sun rose whether hearts were ready or not. She worked as she always did, but her thoughts drifted, Every creak of the fence made her turn her head. He watched her quietly, noting the tension she tried to hide. He wanted to ask questions, but he had learned that some truths came only when invited. Over the next few days, the ranch felt smaller. The open land that once brought comfort now felt exposed. She avoided the road when she could, choosing tasks closer to the house. He noticed and adjusted without comment, taking on more himself. It was not obligation that drove him, but choice. He had lost enough to recognize when something worth protecting stood before him. At night, they talked more than they had before, though never about the rider. They spoke of small things, of weather and work, of the way the land changed with the seasons. In those quiet moments, she felt both safer and more conflicted. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay her past bare and trust that he would not turn away, but fear held her back. She had learned that even good people could walk away once they knew the full truth. He carried his own memories, stirred now by the threat he could not see clearly. Years ago, he had made a promise to someone who believed in him completely. He had failed to keep that promise, not through cruelty, but through fear and hesitation. Losing her had taught him the cost of silence. Watching this woman struggle with her own unspoken past reopened wounds he thought had healed. The townsfolk noticed the rider, too. News traveled fast in places where little happened. Questions began to surface, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. Who was she really? Why had someone come looking for her? He answered with calm firmness, making it clear she was under his roof and that was enough. Some respected that. Others only grew more curious. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence near the edge of the property, she finally spoke of her fear, though not its cause. She told him she worried about bringing trouble to his door, about being the reason his quiet life might shatter. He listened, hands steady as he worked, eyes on the horizon. When he answered, his voice was low but certain. He said trouble had a way of finding people whether they invited it or not. What mattered was how one chose to face it. His words stayed with her long after the sun dipped low. She realized that in offering her shelter he had already chosen a side. That knowledge warmed her and terrified her in equal measure. If the past demanded a price, he might be the one forced to pay it alongside her. The land seemed restless, as if sensing the tension woven through their days. Storm clouds gathered more often, darkening the sky without delivering rain. Animals spooked easily. Even the house creaked and sighed at night, settling into its bones with unease. It felt like the calm before something inevitable. One evening, she found an old box tucked away in the barn, filled with reminders of his life before she arrived. There were letters written in careful script, tools worn smooth by use, and a photograph of a younger man standing beside someone whose smile was full of trust. She replaced everything exactly as she found it, guilt pressing heavy on her chest. Everyone had a past. Hers was just closer to catching up. That same night, the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. They both heard it. They both froze. This time, the horse did not stop nearby. It passed along the far road, unseen but unmistakable. She felt the last of her borrowed peace slip away. He reached for his coat and rifle, more out of habit than threat, and stood at the door long after the sound faded. Neither spoke. Words felt too fragile for what loomed ahead. She knew she could leave, slip away before dawn and spare him what was coming. The thought broke her heart. He sensed her struggle without understanding its shape, and that uncertainty weighed on him like a storm he could not read. As night deepened, the ranch stood quiet, caught between past and future. Somewhere beyond the hills, choices were being made that would soon reach their door. And within the walls of that weathered house, two people faced the same question in silence, whether hope was strong enough to survive what was coming next. The days that followed carried a weight neither of them spoke about, yet it pressed into every moment. Morning light still spilled across the fields, and the land still demanded work, but something unseen had settled between them. She moved carefully now, as if any wrong step might crack what little peace remained. He noticed the way she paused before answering simple questions, the way her eyes followed the road longer than before. Whatever had chased her here was no longer just a memory. It had crossed into the present. From the town came whispers that traveled faster than truth. Someone had seen a rider asking questions at the far edge of the market. Someone else claimed the man carried papers, official looking, though no one could say what they were for. Stories grew larger with every telling. He heard enough to know trouble rarely announced itself plainly. It tested boundaries first, measured strength, waited for weakness. The ranch sat quiet, but it was no longer unnoticed. She remembered another place where rumors had shaped her fate. Once, she had believed if she kept her head down and worked hard, the past would loosen its grip. Instead, it had followed her like a shadow that lengthened with every step. The choices she had made back then were never meant to harm anyone, yet harm had found its way in all the same. She had left because staying would have broken her. Now she feared leaving again might break someone else. One afternoon, while hauling supplies from town, he felt eyes on him. The sensation did not fade when he turned, only shifted, slipping just out of sight. He kept his pace steady, though his senses sharpened. Years of living on the edge of uncertainty had taught him to trust that feeling. When he reached the ranch, he took the longer path around, scanning the hills. Nothing showed itself, but the silence felt watchful. That evening, a neighbor stopped by under the pretense of returning borrowed tools. The visit was friendly enough, but questions slipped through the conversation like needles. Had he noticed strangers around? Did he know much about the woman staying with him? He answered carefully, his tone calm but firm. When the neighbor finally left, the dust from his wagon hung in the air longer than usual. He watched it settle, uneasy. Inside the house, she sensed the shift before he spoke. She asked what was being said in town, and he told her only what she needed to know. Her hands trembled as she poured water into a cup. She apologized, the word falling from her lips like a confession. He frowned at that, telling her no one was to blame for people who could not mind their own business. Still, the apology lingered between them, heavy with meaning. That night, she dreamed of doors closing. Each one she reached for slipped away, leaving her standing alone in the dark. She woke before dawn, heart racing, and sat by the window watching the horizon lighten. She thought of leaving before anyone else could be pulled into her past. The idea felt like tearing herself in two. She had found something here that felt real, something she had not known she was still allowed to want. He rose early too, drawn by a sense that time was tightening. As he stepped outside, he found tracks near the far fence, fresh and deliberate. Someone had been close enough to see the house clearly. Anger flared, not loud or wild, but cold and focused. This land was his responsibility, and anyone stepping onto it without cause had crossed a line. Over breakfast, he mentioned the tracks, watching her face carefully. Color drained from it, though she tried to hide the reaction. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already feared. She asked if he regretted letting her stay. The question cut deeper than any accusation. He answered without hesitation that he did not. Whatever lay ahead, regret would not be among it. Still, silence returned, thicker now. Each of them stood at the edge of truth, unsure who would speak first. She feared that once her story was told, the way he looked at her would change. He feared that pressing her would push her away before she was ready. Between those fears, time stretched thin. In town, the writer appeared again, this time staying just long enough to remind people he existed. He spoke politely, smiled when required, and left behind the sense that he was waiting for something. A few people tried to warn him about the ranch, suggesting it was no place for trouble. The writer only nodded as if already aware. Whatever business he had was unfinished. The woman who ran the general store noticed how often she came in alone now, eyes alert, movements guarded. She offered small kindnesses without questions, extra supplies, a word of comfort. It was not much, but it reminded her that not everyone turned away. Even so, she felt the net tightening. Hope, once a quiet companion, now felt fragile. One evening, a storm finally broke. Rain hammered the land, turning dust to mud and filling the air with sharp, clean scent. Thunder rolled across the hills, rattling the windows. As they worked together to secure the barn, the tension between them crackled like the sky above. In the rush of wind and rain, she almost spoke. The words rose to her lips, but fear pushed them back down. Lightning lit the fields, and for a moment she saw the ranch as it might look after everything fell apart. Empty. Silent. The thought twisted something inside her. She realized then that what she stood to lose was not just safety, but a future she had barely begun to imagine. After the storm passed, the world felt washed raw. He stood on the porch, watching water run off the roof, thinking of all the times he had believed holding back was the safer choice. It had cost him once before. He wondered if he was about to repeat the same mistake. The next day brought another sign. A folded paper lay near the gate, weighted with a stone. There was no message, just a mark pressed into the page, one she recognized instantly. Her breath caught as she showed it to him. This was no accident. Someone wanted her to know she was seen. He read the meaning in her eyes even without understanding the symbol. His jaw tightened. He said nothing, only went to prepare for the possibility of visitors who would not ask permission. The land seemed to lean in, listening, as if aware that whatever came next would leave a mark. She followed him to the barn, watching the steady way he moved, the calm in his actions. She realized how much he had already given her without asking for anything in return. Shelter, trust, a chance to breathe again. The thought of being the reason he might lose all of it felt unbearable. As dusk settled, a figure appeared at the far end of the property, standing still against the fading light. Not mounted this time, waiting. The choice she had been avoiding now stood before her, solid and unavoidable. Tell the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and let the past speak for her. He stepped forward, positioning himself once more between her and what approached. She felt a pull toward him, toward the life they might have had if time and truth had been kinder. The land held its breath again, caught between storm and stillness, as the distance between past and present narrowed to a single, fragile moment. The figure at the far end of the property did not move closer, yet his presence pressed down on the land like a coming storm. The light faded slowly, stretching shadows across the fields, making distance hard to judge. She felt her chest tighten, every instinct urging her to speak now or lose the chance forever. He stood firm beside her, his posture calm but ready, as if the ground itself had taught him how to face what came next. The figure finally turned away, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. No words were exchanged, no demands made, but the message was clear. Time was running out. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her knees weak. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the question he did not ask written plainly in his eyes. They went inside without speaking. The house felt smaller than ever, walls closing in on thoughts too heavy to carry alone. She paced near the window, hands clasped tight, while he sat at the table, waiting, not pushing, not retreating. Just waiting. The silence stretched, filled with the ticking of the clock and the distant call of night birds. She finally spoke, her voice low and uneven. She told him she had not always lived honestly, not because she wanted to deceive, but because survival had demanded it. She spoke of a past shaped by control and fear, of obligations forced on her that she had never agreed to. She had taken something once, not money or land, but information that others wanted buried. Walking away had been her only way out. The people she left behind did not forgive easily. He listened without interruption. The story was not neat or clean, and it did not ask for sympathy. It asked for understanding. When she finished, she waited for the change she had always feared, the pulling away, the judgment. Instead, he leaned back, his face thoughtful, weighed down by the truth but not turned away from it. He told her then about his own past, about the time he had chosen silence over action and lost someone he loved because of it. Fear, he said, wore many faces, and it had robbed him once before. He would not let it do so again without a fight. His words were not dramatic, but they settled deep, steady as the land beneath their feet. Still, danger lingered. The writer, and those behind him, would not stop simply because truths had been shared. The next days were filled with careful planning and quiet vigilance. He spoke with people he trusted, old connections who owed favors and valued fairness. She stayed close to the house, helping where she could, trying not to feel like a burden. Each night she wondered if dawn would bring confrontation. The town felt divided now. Some believed the rumors. Others sensed injustice but were unsure where to stand. The writer returned again, this time openly, speaking with authority that raised questions no one wanted answered. He carried himself like a man used to taking what he wanted through pressure rather than force. His eyes lingered on the ranch whenever he passed. his patience thin but controlled. One morning, a letter arrived with no return mark. Inside were words meant to frighten her into compliance. They promised an end to the chase if she returned what she had taken. They also hinted at consequences if she did not. Her hands shook as she folded the paper. She showed it to him, shame and fear mixing in her chest. He read it slowly, then placed it on the table and met her gaze. He said running would only invite more pursuit. Standing firm would be harder, but it offered a chance at something lasting. The law out here moved slowly, often favoring those with power, but truth had weight when enough people carried it together. He believed they could face this, not alone, but as part of a larger fight for what was right. The days leading up to that stand felt heavy and charged. The land itself seemed to sense it, wind rising unexpectedly, skies darkening without warning. She worked alongside him, learning not just the rhythm of the ranch, but the strength that came from shared purpose. Each glance they exchanged carried unspoken understanding. Whatever happened next would change them both. One evening, as they stood watching the sun dip low, she admitted how afraid she was of losing him, not to violence but to disappointment. He answered by taking her hand, firm and steady. He told her hearts were not meant to be given halfway. If he was offering his, it came with risk. The warmth of that moment stayed with her long after night fell. Word spread quietly that something was coming. Neighbors gathered more often, conversations hushed but determined. Some had faced similar pressures before and knew the cost of staying silent. The ranch became a place of quiet resolve. Not a fortress, but a symbol. The writer noticed the shift and grew impatient. On the morning, everything seemed poised to break. The air was still, too still. She woke early, a sense of finality pressing on her chest. He was already dressed, checking fences and sight lines, not out of fear, but readiness. When their eyes met, there was no doubt left unspoken. Whatever came through that gate would not find them divided. By midday, the rider arrived with others, their presence deliberate and intimidating. They stopped short of the house, voices carrying across the land. Demands were made, sharp and practiced. She stepped forward before fear could stop her, standing beside him rather than behind. Her voice did not shake as she spoke. She said she would not return to silence or surrender truth for safety. The moment stretched, thick with possibility. Neighbors appeared along the edges of the property, not armed, but present, witnesses. The writer's confidence faltered just enough to be noticed. Power, she realized, did not like to be seen too clearly. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows once more, tension hung in the air like a held breath. She felt the future balancing on the edge of choice. Hope, once all she had owned, now felt stronger, rooted in shared courage and hard-earned trust. He stood beside her, unwavering, his heart no longer guarded, but fully given. The land watched, silent and patient, as past and present collided. Whatever happened next would decide not just their fate, but the meaning of everything they had fought to protect. And for the first time since she had begun running, she did not feel alone as the moment of reckoning drew near. The silence after her words felt heavier than any shout could have been. The rider studied her, then the man beside her, then the small group that had gathered along the edges of the land. What had once seemed like an easy reclaim now looked uncertain. Power weakened when faced with light, and this moment stood fully exposed beneath the open sky. He spoke carefully, choosing words meant to sound reasonable. He claimed misunderstandings, suggested quiet arrangements, hinted at how simple things could be if she only cooperated. She listened without flinching. For the first time in a long while, fear did not guide her response. She told him she had already given enough of her life to silence and fear, and she would not give more. The truth she carried was not his to bury. A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. Some nodded, others shifted closer. The rider sensed the change and tried to regain control, raising his voice just enough to remind everyone of his influence. But influence faded when weighed against collective resolve. The land itself seemed to echo that truth, wind stirring the grass in slow agreement. One of the older neighbors stepped forward, speaking calmly about fairness, about how the law was meant to protect, not threaten. Another followed, reminding the writer that people were watching now, not just here but in town as well. What had once been whispered was now spoken aloud. The writer's confidence cracked, replaced by frustration poorly masked. At last, faced with witnesses and unwilling to push further into open conflict, he backed away. Not defeated, but blocked. He warned that this was not over, yet his words carried less weight than before. When he turned and left, the tension did not vanish at once, but something important shifted. The threat had been met, not with violence, but with unity. She felt her legs tremble as the crowd slowly dispersed. Relief washed through her in waves, followed by exhaustion. He reached for her hand, grounding her once more. The neighbors offered quiet support before returning to their own lives, leaving the ranch wrapped in a calm that felt earned rather than borrowed. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the hills in soft gold, they sat together on the porch. Neither spoke for a long time. Words felt unnecessary. The land breathed easy again, and so did they. For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to imagine staying without fear of being chased away. In the days that followed, the writer did not return. Instead, official letters arrived, slower and less threatening, their tone changed by scrutiny and witnesses. The information she carried was finally brought into the open through proper channels. It did not fix everything at once, but it shifted the balance. Truth rarely worked fast, but it worked steady. The town settled into a new rhythm. Some people apologized quietly for believing rumors. Others simply treated her as part of the place now, no longer a question mark. She found comfort in routine again, in honest work and shared meals. Hope no longer felt fragile. It felt rooted. One afternoon, she returned to the fence where she had first stopped weeks ago. The memory felt distant now, softened by everything that had followed. He joined her there, leaning against the post with the same quiet strength she had noticed that first day. She thanked him, not just for standing beside her, but for believing when belief carried risk. He told her that some people came into our lives not to be saved, but to remind us who we are when we choose courage. He admitted that loving again had frightened him more than facing any threat, but holding back would have meant losing twice. This time he chose differently. Seasons began to change. The land shifted from green to gold, then back again. Together they repaired what needed fixing, planned what came next, and allowed the future to unfold without rushing it. Love grew not in grand gestures, but in steady presence, in shared responsibility, in laughter returning to a place that had known too much silence. She no longer carried her past like a burden. It was part of her story, but it did not define her ending. She learned that hope alone could start a journey, but it took trust and courage to finish it. The ranch became more than shelter. It became home. One evening, as stars filled the sky and the land rested quiet and whole, he took her hand and spoke of building something lasting, not just on the land, but between them. She answered with a smile that held both gratitude and certainty. Hearts, once guarded, had found their way back to life. The road beyond the fence still stretched wide, full of unknowns, but it no longer called to her as an escape. It stood instead as a reminder of how far she had come. She had arrived with nothing but hope. She stayed because someone gave her everything, including his heart. And under the open sky, with the land bearing witness, they stepped forward together, not chasing the past, not fearing the future, but living fully in the promise of what they had chosen.